Welcome to Les Bons Mots, a podcast about language learning by ACA, a language training school based in Quebec, Canada. This podcast is designed for people who are learning languages, and each episode will cover a different topic connected to language learning. Thanks for joining us today. I'm your host, Britta Potion Reader. I've been teaching English as a second language for over 10 years, and I'm learning French and Spanish. Language is my passion. This week, I'm joined by my guest, Pierre-William Plante. Pierre has a bachelor's degree in international relations and public affairs from the University of Laval in Quebec City. He moved to Montreal in 2019 and joined Coveo the same year, which sparked a desire in him to become proficient in English, as a lot of his work was conducted in the language of Shakespeare. Pierre-William is a solution specialist at Coveo. Today, we're going to be talking about becoming proficient in a language as an adult and the professional advantages it can bring. We will talk about some of the obvious and less obvious ways that learning a language can be useful in a business context. I'm sure a lot of us will be able to relate to Pierre-William's experience. Let's get started. Pierre-William, welcome to Les Bons Mots. Thank you so much for joining me. It's a pleasure to talk to you today about your professional life and your language learning experience.
Thank you for having me, Brita. I'm excited about it. It's going to be an interesting, hopefully, conversation.
Oh, I'm sure. To begin with, let's talk a little bit about your professional context. I mentioned that you're a solution specialist in sales at Coveo. Maybe you could explain a little bit about what Caveo does for listeners who aren't familiar with the company.
Sure. So Coveo, I'm about to go into a little pitch here. It's convenient because it's my job at Coveo. So very briefly, Coveo is a search and recommendation engine, and it uses AI to personalize the experience. We're basically behind the search boxes of companies around the world, from Mondoux here in Quebec, the pet supply stores, to Salesforce and Dell, the computer company. So if you go on the sites of those companies to search for something, it's powered by Caveo. You probably won't notice it, but we're behind the search experience there.
I mentioned that your title is solution specialist, and you mentioned that a pitch is part of what you do professionally. So, what does being a solution specialist at Coveo involve?
So pitching, I think, goes back to what the image that we have of a salesperson in the old days. It's really a minor part of my job, of my role currently at Caveo. In its simplest expression, I'm a sales guy. So I call and email people to book meetings, and once I get their interest by chatting with them, I understand if our product could help them and their businesses. This is really what it's about. And if there's indeed a fit at Caveo, that's where my job will end. And so I'll introduce them to one of our account executives whose job is to close their business, to bring them to the finish line. My job is twofold, I would say. So the first part is to raise awareness. In the B2B world, a lot of companies are unknown to most people. So a big part of what I do is to get people to know who we are, what we do. But also, I'm trying to target people that I know might have a problem that we can help solve. And that's how generally I get to interact with them. I get them to accept to meet with me ultimately. And so a lot of my job is about problem solving. And it's interesting because it's very different than, I think, what the image I had of a salesperson before I joined Caveo. I think we all have this idea of someone who's going door to door and really trying to sell you something that you might not necessarily need. But if he's pushy enough, if he's convincing enough, you'll get to buy, and you might even regret it afterwards. But it's very different at Caveo because we're in the B2B, I would tend to say. In B2C world, what I just described could be called impulse emotional buying. In the B2B world, the buying process is really chirurgical. So it always involves multiple peoples that are going to question your product, the need for it, the return on investment it's going to bring to the company. So it's all about, will they really need your solution, which is a fair question. But there's not going to be any impulse buying, and you got to prove the value that you're going to bring to that company, to those people, and also some of the pain you're going to alleviate from their day-to-day job.
Yeah, it sounds like because, as you say, you're in business to business sales, that it's a lot about a good fit and identifying problems that need to be solved. And based on what you're saying, it seems like in addition to really strong problem solving skills, you need to have excellent communication skills because this sounds like the bulk of what you're doing with your day is communicating. Is that accurate?
Yes. So talking is my number one way of, of doing my work. And so, yes, communicating is very important. I spend very little time pitching. It's a lot about just informal conversation to, again, to go back to figure out if we're a fit for what the person is looking for. But more than that, also, there's a lot of helping that person identify its problems, put it into words, um, understand the implication of that problem on the business, and then talk in the last part, the last stage, talk about our solution could help solve that problem if it indeed can help. So, yes, there's a lot of just discussions going back and forth, clarifying a statement, asking questions, going back onto something someone said, and yes, it's a lot of communications.
Definitely. I think that by now it should be clear to anyone who's listening that you've managed to attain a really high level of proficiency in your second language. Would you mind telling us a little bit about when you began learning English and what your motivation was?
Sure. Thank you for the good words. By the way, I don't know if I consider myself with a very high level of English, but it started out because I was feeling that my English was not there, that my level of English basically was stopping me from accomplishing what I wanted to do professionally. 3 years ago, I joined Caveo. I always wanted to be in sales at Caveo, but I got turned down twice at first, mostly because my English level was very basic. I studied in Quebec City. I grew up in Lévis, for those who know, and there was never a need for me to learn English more than what I did in high school. And so when I joined Coveo, everything, even though it's a company originally from Quebec, well, it's still from Quebec. Um, the offices are in Montreal. All of our business is conducted, or like 90% of our business is conducted in English. And so if I wanted to join the sales team, and if I wanted to gain the confidence of the sales leader and from the people who would be hiring me, I needed to improve my English, and so that's where I started. Fortunately, I was able to get into the marketing department at Caveo, which was less client facing. I did events marketing back there, and I was able to get English classes paid by Caveo so that I could improve my English level. And so I started with group classes, then transitioned to one-on-one private classes, where it's really where I started developing and evolving my vocabulary, the pronunciation. I was quite, I wouldn't say ashamed, but shy of my pronunciation when I started talking English. This is something I really wanted to improve, and doing one-on-one classes really helped with that. And so that's where I started. It came from being rejected and really wanting to get into the role, and seeing it as the one of the biggest obstacles for me to go where I wanted professionally.
Well, it sounds like you took adversity and you really made something positive about it. You know, we talk in English about making lemons into lemonades. So tell me a little bit about that language learning process. You know, in 3 years, it seems like a relatively short amount of time to make that kind of progress. And I think it's, again, a really fantastic achievement. You mentioned you took some classes through Coveo, some group classes and some private language classes as well. What would you say you got from the group classes, and what would you say you got from the private classes? Like, were there specific advantages to either of those types?
I would say the group classes were good to learn grammar rules mostly. Because we were a group, we would get less time to practice with the teacher, so we were going turn by turn. I really progressed the most during the private classes. I could get real-time feedback. I was also more accountable for doing my homeworks, which in a group class I would tend to not do because I don't know, I would take it less seriously. And then I could also improve a lot more my accent because, again, the real time feedback of the teacher being able to tell me that I was not pronouncing it right and then correct me on the spot. This was really helpful. I remember it being a bit frustrating because it's almost like muscle memory, or a lot of it seems to be muscle memory, where you need to retrain your mouth and your tongue to say words and syllables differently. And so I remember in that class, my teacher telling me over and over again about certain words that I just needed to modify the way I would say it, or change that slightly so it sounded correctly. But again, maybe it was more painful, but in the end, it really helped me fast track my progress. And so I guess those are, I would say, if you are serious about learning English, I would tend to think that a private class is probably the way to go, at least if you want to fast track your learning.
Hmm. I think that a lot of what you've identified are common themes for people who take private classes. It's the fact that you have a lot more time in the spotlight for good and for bad. You're sort of on to produce your language all the time, but you also get a lot of focused feedback. And that sort of helps us sometimes take the next step in our learning. And that's really valuable as well. And it's interesting what you say also about pronunciation, because this is something that comes up a lot in our podcast when we talk about pronunciation. There are those aspects. It's almost, you said it's like muscle memory, or like developing something for sports, when you develop muscles for sports or something like this. It really is, because we hold our mouths in different ways when we speak different languages. We have to form different shapes that maybe we don't in our first language. So it's common, I think, for a lot of people learning English. And I have the same experience learning French, trying to remember how to configure my mouth for certain vowels, especially. So it's not easy.
No, it's not, and I don't know why, but personally, this was one of the reason that I was really motivated to improve my English level. Ultimately, I would love if people wouldn't know that I speak that English is not my first language. I would want to have the pronunciation so exact, so good that you don't even notice it.
Mhm.
And yeah, I associated that for some reasons with a low level English. Although I have friends who at Caveo kept their accent, but have a much broader vocabulary than I do, and are still able to thrive within the company and to progress in their career without ever removing that accent. So I think part of that is just a false belief that I have that the accent is actually stopping me from getting where I want, or stopping people from understanding me. I think it's not that through the more I'm working at Caveo and seeing other people being super successful, although having sometimes very strong accent.
Absolutely. I think that as long as we can make ourselves understood, especially in a Canadian context, there isn't necessarily a need to erase your accent. It's part of our identity. And so for students who want to work on that and want to focus on pronunciation and being really clear and accent reduction, of course, that's something that a language instructor can do with you. But As you noticed, a lot of people can be very successful language users and still preserve their accent. And it's not necessarily a must to erase your accent. And
Yeah.
it's part of who we are, right? So
Yeah.
I would say if you're being hard on yourself about having a bit of an accent, don't. It's just who we are, right? As human beings. So
Yeah, and I'd never thought about what you just said there, that it can be part of your identity. I think it's a really good way to look at it and to make peace with the fact that we have an accent. It's yeah, it shows also part of who we are and where we're coming from, which I should be proud of, I guess, and we should all be proud of.
So, thank you so much for sharing a little bit about what your more formal language learning experience was like. Would you say that there are some informal ways that you learn language or informal sort of methods that you improved your English skills as well?
Yes, there are informal ways where I was able to learn English and improve upon what I was doing in my private classes and more formal experiences. I've always been reading and listening to series in English and consuming Anglophone content. The real challenge for me, and I guess it's probably common too, but has been to talk to have words and have that part of my brain, the muscle that is responsible for bringing up those words, to forming those phrases and interacting on the spot very rapidly. That part of my brain, I always felt that this is what I needed to work on. And so making Anglophone friends really helped me in that sense. First, to keep my brain fired up about talking English. uh, I guess this is more of a fun fact, but I always have a transition period when I come back to the office on Monday, uh, where it takes about a few hours to a few days sometimes for my brain to switch back to Anglophone mode. At first, in the few first days of the week, it's always more challenging. But anyway, having those Anglophone friends during the weekend and being able to incorporate them in my private life helped me keep my brain fired up, but also learn some of that more informal ways of saying things. And that informal also, I don't know if slang is the right word, but expressions that I wouldn't learn so much in a professional settings, but that will do really help when I'm meeting with people and I need to break the ice, or I need to comment on something and make it more funny and less serious, and make people feel comfortable. So yes, being able to have some Anglophone friends outside of work really helped me in that sense.
Yeah, I think a lot of people can relate to what you're saying. Many of us, when we have to make a language switch, it's just there's that little period of adjustment before all of those instincts kick back in and before the words are floating to the surface as quickly as we would like them to. And we're finding exactly what we want to say. And we sort of get our rhythm back in that language in a way.
Yeah, and this is something that has always frustrated me. In French, words will pop up in my mind as I'm talking, as almost as if they appear to me, and I can just select them. In English, sometimes I'll get in in a conversation or to a point in a conversation where I know there's a specific word that exists for what I want to say, but it's just not coming to my mind, and so I'll have to resort back to simpler terms or to break down in more terms what I want to say, and so even to that day, not being able to get that same level of fluidity in English is something that makes me want to improve furthermore my level of English.
I think what you just mentioned, again, so many of us can relate to that moment where we're looking for the word and it's just not quite coming. But the strategies that you just outlined are really fantastic ones that you can use, resorting to a simpler term or explaining in other words, giving the definition of what you mean or giving some kind of explanation instead. Those are fantastic strategies. And as a teacher, I'm always guilty of suggesting those to my students as well. And as a French speaker, I use those regularly. I'm thinking about the time I went into a shop and I wanted to purchase a can opener, like the device that we use to open a can of soup or something. And it wasn't until normally I prepare for these kind of interactions, but it wasn't until I was actually in the store that I realized I had no idea what that thing was called. And I was like, excusez-moi, vendez-vous la chose pour ouvrir les produits en conserve. And I was using a little bit of body language. We communicated, it wasn't as elegant, but we get there in the end, right? This is the purpose of a language. So,
Yeah, and it took me a while. I feel like I'm just starting to embrace it. And the more I
mhm.
embrace it, the more fun it can be, because what you just described there, I'm sure on the other end of the receipt, the person that was in front of you was probably having a good time, like having empathy about what the message you were trying to say. And the more I'm embracing resorting to those techniques, the more fun it gets, and the more fluid as well my conversations are, and the less pressure too I put on my brain and on finding the right word. And funny enough, it often helps me finding more of those right words when I lower the pressure and I accept that I might just need to go back to some mimicking and using different words that what I intended for at first. So yeah, I guess embracing those techniques is probably a good way in the right direction.
Mhm. You mentioned that occasionally finding vocabulary words can be a challenge. Is there anything else that you still find challenging about operating in English?
Yes. So I also learned Spanish when I was younger, and I found that the syntax of sentences, uh, when you compare Spanish and French, it's very similar. And so it was always easy for me to make sentences in Spanish because I would just think the same way I'm usually thinking about creating sentences in French. In English, I'm quite often struggling with the structure of a phrase and the syntaxes and where to put the words. And so I'll sometimes reverse words. I'll feel like I'm not saying I'm not putting the verb in the right place, and all that. So this is something I'm still finding challenging when I'm talking English, and even more so after I learned Spanish, and seeing how easy it was for my brain to form sentences in Spanish.
Curse you, English. Why can't you be more like Spanish? Why do you have to have a different sentence structure?
Right. Why can all languages be the same?
Oh, there's no fun in that. I mean,
Yeah.
there's maybe no frustration in that, but there's no fun in that either. So,
Yeah.
you mentioned that you learned English at Coveo initially as a way of achieving a professional goal. What have been some of the advantages that you've gotten from learning this language and from improving your language skills?
So I think that people are being a little softer on me when I'm on those business meetings, since well, they clearly see that English is not my first language. I think in sales, particularly, a salesman can be threatening in a way to someone because you feel like you're going to get manipulated, or you're going to be forced to do something you might not want to do. English not being my native language, I do feel like I'm less threatening to people. And so they will maybe put down their guard more easily and will open up a bit more, I tend to think, during meetings. And I'm also backing this up by the fact that I've been very, and I'm saying this very humbly, but I've been very successful at Caveo in what I do. Right now, I'm overseeing companies in the Bay Area in California. And so those are all the big logos that you can think of, the companies that you will go to when you want to stream something at night, or you want to book your next villa on your next trip. So I'm able to run meetings with those companies, run sales campaigns, sales motions that are taking months to get to the finish line. And with my level of English, I don't know. I feel like I've had a lot of success, and part of that is maybe because I am less intimidating because of that. The other part to that is that it forces me to do a lot of preparation before my meetings and before I get onto those calls, because I feel less confident in improvising during a conversation. So I think it'll also make it seems like I'm super prepared and I have all of my questions written down, and it forces me to probably be more empathetic, put myself more in the shoes of the person I'm going to talk with, because of that, because I want to make sure that I can anticipate some of where the conversation might go, or I can also guide it in a certain direction from the start and as it's evolving. So this is probably and for sure one of the biggest advantages. It forces me to prepare, and I'm also probably more direct because I have less vocabulary. And in a sense, I think that it's refreshing for people in a sales context, in a sales environment, to have someone that will go straight to the point, even though I'm not doing it because I'm choosing it. I'm doing it because it's my only way forward. so, so those are some of the great advantages being in sales and English not being your native language.
That's so fascinating. I really think that those kind of unexpected advantages are certainly not something we would ever anticipate when we begin this kind of language learning journey. You know, we tend to think about the advantages that come from the mastery of the language and not some of the advantages that come from our unique position or perspective in an interaction with another person, and what kind of inadvertent advantages that can bring us. So it's really, really fascinating to hear you describe that. I had no idea that you could have these sort of secret advantages.
I certainly didn't think of them of advantages until I joined Caveo and realized that I could be very successful as well. So glad if this can be, if I can share, spread the good words.
Absolutely. Help people look for the less obvious advantages within their own context, and think about language learning in that way as well, too. And being a second language or additional language user as well. Pierre-William, I'm wondering if I could put you on the spot a little bit here. It's clear that much of your job is spent talking to a really wide range of people. And as you said, you know, everybody from your colleagues and your Anglophone friends up to executives at the kind of tech companies that we think about when we hear the Bay Area or Silicon Valley, something like this. And it made me think that you might be the perfect resource to talk to about a subject that a lot of us struggle with as language learners, and that is small talk. And I think the name's a little bit deceiving. We call it small talk, but for a lot of people, this can be really intimidating to engage in a second language. Do you have any tips or tricks that you use to help you break the ice in a small talk conversation, or advice you would give to somebody else who's maybe having to speak to clients in English for the first time, or building relationships with people in other countries?
This is one of the rare moments where, as you were asking the questions, words were popping in my mind in English. So I guess
Woo,
this is
progress.
yes, I guess this is either a question I'm passionate about, or yeah, I'm making progress. But one of the things that I've been doing that is helping me is showing vulnerability and making somewhat fun of myself. So I'll specifically call out the French accent when I join on my meeting. So I'll open it up by saying where I'm based out of. So I'm in Montreal, and that's why you hear the French accent. And so it just breaks the ice and removes some of the pressure off of my shoulders, and then just yeah being somewhat vulnerable about where I'm coming from, and not trying to hide, or I wouldn't say deceive people, but camouflage any of what I really am. So I'll call out specifically. Sometimes I'll just thank people for giving me 30 minutes, because I know that talking to a sales guy can be in between jury dentist and jury duty and going to dentist. And so I guess I would say being vulnerable and accepting that you're not gonna, I wouldn't say be perfect, but you're gonna be who you are, and just, yeah, be tolerant with yourself. The other aspect to that is that, interestingly enough, I'll try to avoid small talk on first meetings, because, at least when it comes to business meetings, because sometimes I know that the people I'm talking with, they're evaluating three other vendors or four other vendors, and they've been on 5 meetings, and they're fed up of saying where they're from and how's the weather and all of that. So I'll just call it out. So I guess probably not the answer you wanted to to get, but in certain business contexts, I feel like skipping the small talk makes it better for the conversation. And later on, once they trust that you can help them, they see that you know what you're talking about and that you're serious about all of this, that I feel is a good moment to go back to the small talk, because they know that they won't lose their time. They know that they have someone with who they can trust, and so they're more ready to open. I don't know if it makes sense, but it's like putting the small talk at the end once you've built trust and people know that you can really help them, and you won't waste their time.
I think that that's excellent advice. As you said, it sets you apart from perhaps the 5 other calls that they've just been on, and it allows you to connect perhaps in a more authentic way once you've already built some kind of trust and rapport with the clients. So I think that that makes a lot of sense. So it's something else we can think about in a business context. Maybe leave the small talk until you're wrapping things up or something like this.
Yeah, and trust and rapport about something they care about, right? Like, realistically, I barely have enough time to see my friends and my family, so I won't start getting friends with all the people I'm talking to business wise, because, of course, I'm not going to follow up. And I mean, there's just so much people you can have in your life. So in this specific context, and this is particularly relevant to my experience, but they come to me because they have a problem they want to solve, and that's really what matters to them. So until they know that I can really help them solve that problem, they're a little cautious about, are they going to waste their time? Should they be doing something else? Do they really need to explore this solution? So I'd rather get them to understand this, and if we're a fit, and once that is done, then start building more of an informal rapport, because I feel like now they're fully engaged, basically.
That's really excellent advice and a really interesting way of looking at it. So I really appreciate you letting me put you on the spot and talk about small talk in a kind of impromptu way.
Well, it was my pleasure.
Pierre-William, every week with our guests, we usually talk about an expression or a phrasal verb of the week. And listening to you talk about the expected and unexpected benefits that we get from working in a second language or using a second language made me think about the expression, the icing on the cake. Are you familiar with this expression?
I am. I have a very sweet tooth.
Perfect. It's a perfect expression for a sweet tooth. Would you mind sharing with our listeners exactly what that expression means?
So it means when something makes a situation even better than it already is.
It made me think about it when you were talking about these extra benefits that are sort of the icing on the cake of learning a language. We might expect the benefits of getting the job that was our goal or a higher salary or something like this, but some of those unexpected benefits really are the icing on the cake. Is there an equivalent to this expression in French that we could use?
There are probably more than one actually. The one I know is in French, la cerise sur le sundae. It's funny because it has a very clearly English word in it, but that's the one I know. And yeah, I mean, it's very common as well. And yeah, it's an interesting one because it's so common that for me it's one of those expressions that I'd never like question its origin and what it truly means. But now that we're discussing it, I'm realizing that it's the small things that really makes transform an experience from great to like perfect or amazing. And yeah, I'm looking at it slightly differently now, although I've been using it for so many years.
That's the beauty of learning a language. When we learn something new in our second or our additional language, it often makes us reflect differently on our first language too, which is kind of delightful.
Yes, totally. This is and it's an interesting way also to learn a language. I find I've heard once that if you really want to learn a language, you got to enjoy the words, the way it sounds, those kind of quirky, funny meanings to certain phrases, and yeah, that aspect of learning a language, if you embrace it, can help you accelerate even more your learning.
Anything that we can do to make the process more enjoyable is going to help us feel more motivated to do it. So I agree with you 100% as a language instructor and as a language learner. Totally true. Pierre-William, I want to thank you again so much for joining me today on Les Bons Mots and for sharing your experience with our listeners. I know with complete certainty that a lot of what you shared will resonate and also will be really inspiring for those of us who are on our language learning journey and using English in a professional setting. So it's been an absolute pleasure to hear your story. And thank you again so much for sharing with us.
Thank you for having me, and I really hope that it's going to indeed resonate with your listeners and show them an other side of learning a language in a professional context and in a challenging one.
I have no doubt about that. That brings us to the end of this week's episode of Les Bons Mots. Come visit us on our website at lesbonsmots.ca. We have a lot of content on our blog where we post regularly about news, culture, and language learning, and you can find our language learning videos link there as well. Do you have any questions or suggestions? We'd love to hear from you. You can email us at lesbonsmots@lesateliers.ca or find us on Facebook and Instagram at lesateliers.ca. Reach out to us if you're interested in learning more about our language training programs, or if you want to talk to us about ways in which you can improve your skills. If you enjoyed this podcast, please rate, review, and subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts to help other language learners find us. Thanks again, and happy practicing.